Next stop, Ohio. Hi, I'm Philip Blumel. Welcome to No Uncertain Terms, the official podcast of the Term Limits movement. This is episode number 269, published on August 25th, 2025.
Your sanctuary from partisan politics.
Ohio is the next state to seriously consider term limits for the U.S. Congress. So far in 2025, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Indiana have all officially approved the Congressional Term Limits resolution on Congress, bringing the total number of states to 12. Unfortunately, the resolution fell short in Georgia and Arizona, where it won only one chamber of the legislature, when, of course, both are required. Well, we'll be back in those states next year. But for now, the new battleground for congressional term limits is Ohio. Representative Heidi Workman, District 72, and Senator Teresa Gavarone in District 2 have filed House Joint Resolution 3 and Senate Resolution 6 for Ohio to join the states calling for an Article 5 convention for proposing Congressional Term Limits amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This is what we call the Term Limits Convention bill. As you may recall, the U.S. Term Limits state chair in Ohio, Bernie Moreno, is now U.S. Senator of Ohio, Bernie Moreno. Moreno was replaced by former state representative and former state senator Kevin Coughlin. And Coughlin is making great progress in pushing the Term Limits Convention resolution. Ohio is fertile ground. The governor and the legislature is term limited, and the citizens of the state overwhelmingly support the existing limits. On the other hand, Ohio is one of the states with a full-time legislature. Full-time legislators who make a full-time professional salary tend to be a bit more touchy about this issue of term limits, since their dependence on this job and re-election is greater than in other states. Coughlin saw the light on term limits. As a former legislator who himself was term limited out of his job as an Ohio state senator, he's a master at handling his former colleagues as the resolution winds its way through the committee process in the Ohio House. Here's Coughlin presenting House committee testimony in favor of the term limits resolution just 2 weeks ago.
I would now call Kevin Coughlin to testify. Thank you for being here. Begin when ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks very much for the opportunity to testify. I'm here serving in my capacity as state chair of U.S. Term Limits to urge you to favorably report House Joint Resolution 3, and I want to thank Representative Heidi Workman for sponsoring this important measure. In their wisdom, our founders set up a system that accommodates the interest of the people through the states in a variety of ways in different places, and in this particular case, it allowed for amendments of the United States Constitution to be initiated in two ways, one by Congress and one by the states. HJR 3 gives Ohio an opportunity to join with 12 other states in exercising its right to call for an Article 5 convention of the states limited to the issue of congressional term limits. I've not always been a fan of a convention of the states, but number one, the urgency of our situation in our federal government, as well as putting forward a resolution that is narrowly drafted to a single subject, and I would say practically drafted to a single subject that's an 80-20 issue that enjoys the support, majority support of Republican voters and Democrat voters across the country and across the state, makes it something that is worth pursuing. You've heard from Republican Florida Governor DeSantis and Ohio Democratic Congressman Greg Landsman the arguments for congressional term limits and the overwhelming public support that they enjoy. I do want to take a minute to just give you a little bit of a personal perspective because I did serve here for 4 years in this chamber. In fact, the 46th district, Mr. Chairman, which I don't think is in the same place anymore.
I don't think so at all.
No.
They haven't redrawn me up that way yet.
4 years here in the House before term limits took effect, and then a decade in the Ohio Senate after term limits took effect in the year 2000. And during my time here, I was not a particularly big fan of term limits for all the usual reasons that you all have probably talked about amongst yourselves and heard from many other people. Simply put, after 24 years of a term limit experiment in this state, Ohio's doing just fine. You all seem to be just fine. We have very good leaders. We've had some bad leaders, but the state on the whole has moved forward, has improved, the economy is strong, and the business of policy making continues. Do we miss seasoned and experienced voices in the process. Well, yes, and not really. Each new member brings their own talents and perspective to the legislature, as they should. And the accumulation of knowledge and seniority expands and contracts to the space that is available. If you know you're going to be here for 30 years, you're going to take that long to get effective, or maybe you never will. If you know you're going to be here for a finite time, as I did, knowing every single day that there was where the finish line was, you learn more quickly, you find ways to be effective where you are, and you raise your game. After 2 decades of term limits, are staff and lobbyists running the state? Hardly. If anything, the elected representatives of the people are more assertive and more determined to leave their imprint on public policy. Anyone who's interacted with members of Congress know that they are heavily dependent on staff. That's not going to change with term limits. But the fresh perspective that a member and a shorter runway that they have to work with will ensure that the people's representatives remain firmly in charge of the process. Here in Ohio, over the last several years, we've seen a legislature tackling issues that generations before them have been unable or unwilling to tackle. Indeed, you're doing that now. Term limits embolden our elected officials to solve problems and show results. We need that very much in Congress. Just the sheer scope of the expansion of our federal government, our staggering public debt, and the erosion of congressional authority have all happened on the watch of supposedly experienced and seasoned political class. Term limits will hasten the return to the citizen legislature that the founders intended. And I go back to the first point that I made there. We have over 400 public agencies that are basically making law every single day with very, very little oversight by the only people in town who are directly elected by the people. That has been that's not new. That's been going on for 55 years as Congress has slowly given over its power to the executive branch. This has been done by people who are supposedly seasoned and experienced. So we are asking that Ohio join with other states and use a provision that was very purposely put in the Constitution by our founders to give the people an opportunity to initiate the process of amending our Constitution.
Next, last week's episode of No Uncertain Terms struck a chord with many. Recall, the theme was that term limits is a bipartisan reform, and presented polling data and anecdotes to remind everybody that term limits are a big winner among Democrats, too, even though sometimes politicians like to obscure this fact for partisan purposes. In any case, a new quote was shared with me since that episode that I think is worth relating to you. Democratic Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky is being talked about as a potential presidential candidate. And in his 2019 campaign for governor, Beshear expressed support for 8-year term limits for the Kentucky legislature. He said, quote, "By expanding limits to cover legislators, we can start to end the cycle of corruption in Frankfort, the state capital. Implementing term limits will open up the legislature to a whole new generation of Kentucky leaders and ideas." He's right. Politicians can make rules to try to curb corruption, but the truth is, if the reforms don't change the incentives faced by politicians, the politicians will find workarounds and loopholes to permit business as usual. In a recent interview, another Kentucky politician, U.S. Representative Thomas Massie, shared a couple of the tricks that politicians play in the U.S. Congress. The politicians may get credit for making these type of rules, but what good are they if they're only for show?
Like, a lobbyist can't buy me food. But I can go to lunch, pick up the tab, and the lobbyist can write me a $5,000 check to my campaign, and then my campaign can pay for the food. No. So they've created this rule to say that lobbyists can't buy you food, but what good does it do when the lobbyist can give you the money and you buy the food?
And that's common practice?
Yeah. Like, it's a campaign expense at that point. Don't shoot the messenger. And that's just, I mean, that's the way it works. I'm giving you an example of a rule that doesn't really work. Like, you can put rules in place. What are some other things? The lobbyists, when they give you money, ostensibly, they're not giving you their money. They're not even giving you their corporation's money. They are giving you money from employees of that corporation who have pooled their money into like a club or a group. And they've been persuaded maybe by their management that they should give a little back to this because their job would be more secure if they supported their lobbying efforts in DC. So the employee, you're actually ostensibly, it's money from employees of that company that's being channeled to the lobbyists that's then given to, and the lobbyists are supposedly representing the employees' interests. That's the workaround they have to keep corporations from giving members of Congress money directly.
Next, National Affairs reporter John Fund recently shared with readers of National Review magazine in June a full update on the progress of the term limits resolution, its opponents, and its likely endgame, preemption by Congress. Under the headline, Congressional term limits are hugely popular, Fund advises, lawmakers, don't let paper tiger Birchers tell you otherwise. This piece is worth reading in its entirety, so here we go. Americans' frustration with Congress is boiling over again. That means the idea of term limits on Congress is back and is even more popular than it was in the 1990s when 23 states voted to impose term limits on their own congressional delegations, but were thwarted by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision. A recent poll by Quinnipiac University found that disapproval rates have grown for Republicans and Democrats in Congress. Only 32% of voters approve of how congressional Republicans are doing their job, and a mere 21% approve of Democrats' performance. Over the past 13 months, legislatures in North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Indiana, Louisiana, and South Dakota have passed resolutions calling for an Article 5 convention to impose term limits on Congress. Ohio and Arizona may be about to follow. The movement, led by the nonprofit organization U.S. Term Limits, has gained remarkable momentum. While resolutions must be approved in at least 34 states to trigger a convention, the far more probable outcome is that Congress will act first, proposing its own term limits amendment with a grandfather clause to avoid having tougher terms dictated by the states. The message from the states is clear. Americans are done waiting. If one were to ask Americans, why doesn't Congress have term limits? Nearly all would put the blame on career politicians in Washington. The swamp is self-serving, of course, which means it is loath to limit its own power. Indeed, many members of Congress are opposed to term limits. But these careerists have found an unexpected ally, the John Birch Society. If Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are the quarterback and halfback, the John Birch Society serves as the offensive line. The Birch Society's playbook is quite simple. It gets in the ear of Republican state legislators who of late have been debating whether to vote for an Amendment 5 convention limited to the topic of congressional term limits. It deploys a tiny but committed volunteer force, consisting mostly of retirees. They have the time to attend public hearings and send emails to legislative offices to oppose the bills. Moreover, Bircher leaders often tell their members that a convention would result in repeal of the right to free speech and the right to bear arms, which instills a sense of apocalyptic doom in Birch Society members and motivates them to make calls and, of course, to send more checks to the Birch Society. But these fears are misplaced. Congress will never allow a term limits convention, and the pro-term limits side knows it. Their convention strategy is a means of forcing Congress to propose the amendment, which it will not do in the absence of pressure. If a convention were to be held, state legislators would propose retroactive, prospective, or even short-term limits, so Congress would act first to ensure any limits protect incumbents. As a consequence of the John Birch Society's activities, many Republican state lawmakers, particularly in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, are too afraid to vote for congressional term limits. This fear, too, is misplaced. Despite roaring loudly at public hearings and sending chain emails, the Birch Society has never defeated a single office holder over his or her support for a convention for term limits. Ever since Ronald Reagan and William F. Buckley made it clear they had no use for the Birch Society's conspiracy theories, the organization has been a paper tiger. Fortunately, many Republican state office holders have begun to realize this. Even Wisconsin, where the John Birch Society is headquartered, opted to vote for the term limits resolution in 2022. Lawmakers faced zero political consequences. The tendency of GOP legislators to acquiesce to the Birchers is even more bizarre when one considers who is bankrolling the other side. U.S. Term Limits is a group controlled by wealthy real estate magnate Howard Rich. He's a legendary political bundler who serves on the board of the Club for Growth, which spent $150 million on congressional and other races last year. Unlike the John Birch Society, Rich has been putting his money where his mouth is. In the last 2 election cycles, U.S. Term Limits and his affiliated PACs have spent millions electing state legislators who have signed a pledge to vote for the Term Limits convention. They've also spent millions to defeat opponents of the bill, often to great effect. Between 2022 and 2024, Rich's groups knocked out 5 anti-term limit incumbents in the Arizona legislature alone. Earlier this year, the Arizona House of Representatives, emboldened by a new term limits majority, passed the Article 5 resolution narrowly. The idea of congressional term limits is already immensely popular, with 86% support from Democrats and 90% support from Republican voters. Candidates and lawmakers who listen to the John Birch Society are not only ignoring their constituents, they are also putting their own careers in danger. Well put, John. Thank you.
Like the show? You can help by subscribing and leaving a 5-star review on both Apple and Spotify. It's free.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of No Uncertain Terms. The term limits convention bills are moving through the state legislatures. This could be a breakthrough year for the term limits movement. To check on the status of the term limits convention resolution in your state, go to termlimits.com/takeaction. There, you will see if it has been introduced and where it stands in the committee process on its way to the floor vote. If there's action to take, you'll see a Take Action button by your state. Click it. This will give you the opportunity to send a message to the most relevant legislators, urging them to support the legislation. They have to know you are watching. That's termlimits.com/takeaction. If your state has already passed the term limits convention resolution, or the bill's not been introduced in your state, you can still help. Please consider making a contribution to U.S. term limits. It is our aim to hit the reset button on the U.S. Congress, and you can help. Go to termlimits.com/donate. termlimits.com/donate. Thanks. We'll be back next week.
Find us on most social media at U.S. Term Limits. Like us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and now LinkedIn.
USTL.